The events of Attack of the Clones marks the very beginning of the Clone Wars, with the Battle of Geonosis kicking off the grueling 2-year galactic war that shaped the rest of the galaxy itself. However, the Battle of Geonosis set up far more than just a war, but also a very distinct rivalry between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and the new Sith Lord, Count Dooku. The Duel of Geonosis is one of the more iconic lightsaber duels in recent history, as it marks when the Jedi would officially declare war on the Sith once again, after hundreds of years of the Jedi believing the Sith had died. Count Dooku himself was once a Jedi, and would duel and defeat Obi-Wan and Anakin very quickly, despite both of them being considered talented knights. Obi-Wan, in fact, went down much faster than even his Padawan would, and following this duel, it would seem that almost every time Obi-Wan ever engaged Dooku, he would be put down extremely quickly. There has never been a moment that Obi-Wan has gotten to get a leg up on his master's master, a fact which would remain until the day that Dooku died. And it all started with that first failure on behalf of Obi-Wan on Geonosis. So what is it that made Obi-Wan so weak to Dooku on that day specifically? Why couldn't Obi-Wan last even half a minute against Darth Tyrannus? Well, today, my friends, we are going to open up yet another holocron and talk about why. But before we continue with the holocron, I'd like to introduce to you guys a brand new channel that I created about another one of my passions, that being the genre of horror. On the channel, we will be exploring various monsters, cryptids, and demons, as well as killers from some of the most famous films of all time. Right now on the channel, we've documented the history of the Exorcist demon Pazuzu, as well as the Death Angels from A Quiet Place, and most recently, we discussed the 7 stages of infection from the Last of Us universe. So if that's something that you're interested in, the horrendous wave will be linked down below. But now, let us begin. I think we can all go ahead and bypass the obvious statement that should be made. Count Dooku far outclasses Obi-Wan in blade skill during Geonosis. Dooku was considered by many, even Sidious, to be one of the greatest duelists of that era, with Sidious believing that the only rivals to Dooku in the blade were perhaps himself and the Grandmaster in Yoda, a hypothesis that would be proven, as Dooku was able to stalemate the great Grandmaster. A feat, need I remind you, that not even Sidious was capable of blade to blade. In Revenge of the Sith and their duel on Coruscant, Sidious in the novelization put away his lightsaber so that he could fall back on his force powers, of which he was the superior to Yoda, being overwhelmed by the blade skill of the Jedi Master of over 900 years. And yet, Dooku managed to match Yoda and only distract him for a moment so that he could get away before more Jedi arrived. The question of skill and experience is barely even a factor here. However, we didn't want to just leave it at that. We wanted to dive into the exact hows and why and whys on how Dooku was able to dismantle and frankly embarrass Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically. Why this is one of Obi-Wan's greatest defeats as one of the greatest swordsmen of all time. Dooku was ready and Dooku embarrassed him. But something important needs to be addressed. We can't simply discount the fact that this was the same Obi-Wan who, as a Padawan, kept up with and even defeated Darth Maul, an assassin trained by Sidious to kill Jedi. Unfortunately, Obi-Wan would find Dooku to be in a caliber all his own, mostly because unlike Maul, Dooku was entirely familiar with the Jedi way and method of fighting. It would be around this time that Obi-Wan had ceased training in the form that he used as a Padawan under Qui-Gon Jinn, Form 4 Ataru, and Kenobi began to practice the methods of Form 3, the all-defensive form Surisu. Not only was the defense far better for deflecting blaster fire, but he witnessed how Qui-Gon had gotten tired out in his older age against Maul, which resulted in his defeat. Because of this, Obi-Wan began to study the more energy-conservative Surisu, so that he would be able to last much longer in drawn-out engagements. Obi-Wan knew that since the Sith had returned, he was going to need a form that would suit him against a stronger opponent, because Ataru had not only failed Qui-Gon, but himself as well. Obi-Wan's rage had unbalanced him, and his offensive sequences positioned him right in front of the reactor shaft that Maul was able to push him down. Ataru was simply not meant for Obi-Wan. However, Obi-Wan was not yet proficient in Form 3 lightsaber combat against Dooku either. Remember, this was only Attack of the Clones Obi-Wan. He was still a Jedi Knight and had much room to grow. Dooku noticed this when they began to fight. After a single burst of Force lightning, Dooku could tell from Obi-Wan's block that he was practicing Surisu. So the natural thing to do was for Dooku to bring Obi-Wan out of his defensive shell and force him to attack. You see, Sarisu functions beautifully as a way to protect oneself against many opponents or one very aggressive enemy. The form was designed to try and draw out engagements as a way to create holes in your enemy's defense, and then take advantage of the given openings. This is why Obi-Wan was so perfect against General Grievous. He was able to deflect all of his attacks and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Not striking with all of his force at once, but rather cutting around his opponent's defense. The key to Sarisu. The weakness though with Sarisu is that it has very few offensive options in its sequences. This lack of offense was what actually caused Sarisu practitioners to create Form 5 lightsaber combat, the form that Anakin would later use. Clearly, this would be something that Dooku was quite well versed in, so by then fighting defensively, not attacking first, but letting Obi-Wan come to him, Dooku put himself at the advantage. Could he have fought Obi-Wan using Sarisu and defeated him? Most likely, if he had chosen to go on the offensive. But on Geonosis, Dooku was trying to escape and prevent himself from being captured by the Jedi. Had Obi-Wan used Sarisu, he could have stalled long enough for Yoda and the other clones to get there and arrest him. By staying on the defense though for the moment, Dooku forced Obi-Wan to rely on the only offensive knowledge that he had, that being Ataru. The fourth form of lightsaber combat was one that Dooku was extremely familiar with, a form he knew almost as well as Makashi, although he never implemented it. Not only was Form 4 the chosen style of Dooku's master Yoda, but also of his pupil in Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon's form was something Dooku could pick out like a second language. In this way, Obi-Wan's own knowledge of Ataru stood no chance, especially considering he was out of practice with it, and Dooku's form of Makashi famously counters Form 4. Essentially, Dooku forced Obi-Wan to pick the worst form imaginable against Dooku. The problem with Kenobi here is that his offense is weak and lacking, an issue that persisted even after Geonosis. During the Clone Wars, almost every time Obi-Wan goes on the offensive, he loses. A perfect example of this is his reunion with Maul during the Clone Wars. This is especially telling because Obi-Wan dueled a weaker Maul. Not only had he lost his lower legs, and his potential in the Force was essentially cut in half, but he was still recovering from his exile. This should have been an easy win for Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan as a Jedi Master should have easily taken him out. However, the death of Qui-Gon Jinn still laid heavy on Obi-Wan's mind, and his rage unbalanced him. Unlike Anakin, whose rage made him stronger, when Obi-Wan actively gives in to anger, he drastically diminishes his strength. This is what Maul was relying on and preying on, and this is the lesson that Obi-Wan ultimately learned when he would best Maul for the final time on Tatooine many years later. But back to Dooku specifically, Obi-Wan again would never manage to defeat the Count. When it came to Geonosis, had Obi-Wan possessed the knowledge of Sarisu that he did in Revenge of the Sith, then the outcome may have been much different. In Revenge of the Sith and the novelization, Obi-Wan's Sarisu had become so good that it even shocked Dooku on the Invisible Hand. Dooku had just anticipated that he would be able to stomp him out just as he did on Geonosis. But in the novel, Dooku realizes the full potential of Kenobi's Form 3. The perfected form. Dooku describes Obi-Wan's lightsaber as being bewilderingly fast and complicated in its defensive sequences. And what truly terrified Dooku was how perfectly it paired with the likes of Anakin's Form 5 gem So. In Attack of the Clones though, Obi-Wan didn't possess the full knowledge of the third form, and wasn't yet the master of Sarisu that he one day would be. It wasn't in his skill set yet to be patient and outlast Dooku. His eagerness to capture the Count and end the war before it began overshadowed the importance of what was happening. Of course, we can't entirely blame Obi-Wan though. During the ship ride to the duel with Dooku, Obi-Wan knew in his inner thoughts that it would take Anakin and himself alone that could only stand a chance against Dooku maybe. And when he engages him alone after Anakin attacks too abruptly, he knows that he's fighting a losing battle. Obi-Wan knew full well that he had no chance of defeating Dooku by himself. He even says as much during the gunship chase when Anakin wanted to go back for Padme. Obi-Wan says, "I can't take Dooku alone. I need you. Obi-Wan was confident in Anakin's strength enough to know that perhaps with their combined power, they could match, or maybe if they were lucky, defeat the Count. By now, he had seen what Anakin was capable of, and knew that even though his Padawan was inexperienced, he made up for it with raw power. Anakin's strength and talent would surely give them just the edge they needed to overcome Dooku, so much as they worked together. Whether this is true or not, we'll never know, as nothing went according to plan. When Obi-Wan was left all alone, it was here that after witnessing Dooku use the legendary dark side ability that he likely only heard of in stories, in Dun Mok, penetrating his enemies' minds, insulting them, that Obi-Wan realized just how overwhelmed he truly was. He forced Obi-Wan on the offensive, where he was weak. Dooku adopted a near-perfect style of defensive Makashi, and when Obi-Wan desperately went on the offensive, Dooku was able to slip his guard and intentionally decides not to murder Obi-Wan, instead simply nicking his leg as a show of disappointment. But anyway, my friends, this is why Obi-Wan was so incredibly weak to Dooku on Geonosis. I hope you enjoyed this more technical reasoning why Dooku and Obi-Wan were such an odd pairing in Attack of the Clones. And tell us, what do you think of our breakdown? Do you like when we go back over these duels and break down everything in great detail? Let us know in the comments down below. And as always, my friends, may the Force be with you and have an excellent day.